The big three automakers are not happy. They say a deal that charges lower tariffs on Japanese imports than on North American cars with high American content is a bad deal.
In a single strategic decision involving more than 180 billion United States dollars in projected investment, Japan redirected the future of electric vehicles, batteries, and advanced automotive manufacturing away from the United States and toward Canada, placing over 300,000 American auto jobs, tens of billions in household income, and the long-term industrial credibility of the trade war strategy itself at immediate risk. This was not a routine trade announcement, and it was not a temporary adjustment. Japan's choice exposed a deeper truth that many policymakers in Washington refused to confront. This opening shock is only the visible layer of the damage. What Japan has triggered beneath the surface is far more severe than any investment headline or job loss projection released so far. Today, I will reveal a consequence so destabilizing that it threatens to permanently shift industrial power away from the United States toward Canada, with losses that have never been publicly quantified, never debated in Congress, and never fully acknowledged by Washington. The true scale of this damage is only now becoming clear, and once it is understood, the implications will be impossible to ignore. Within months of the decision, open source industry trackers, lender disclosures, and trade group assessments converged on a disturbing reality. More than 220 billion United States dollars in planned automotive, electric vehicle, and advanced manufacturing investment had either been frozen, delayed indefinitely, or redirected out of the United States pipeline. To understand the scale, that figure alone exceeds the total capital deployed into the United States auto sector during several post-crisis recovery years combined. This was not lost growth. It was erased momentum. Employment impacts followed quickly. Conservative labor models now project that between 380,000 and 450,000 American jobs are exposed over the next 5 years if current trajectories persist. These are not peripheral positions. They include assembly workers, power electronics engineers, logistics operators, tooling specialists, and regional suppliers whose average annual wages exceed 75,000 United States dollars. When those incomes vanish, entire regional economies hollow out. Analysts estimate an annual loss of more than 30 billion United States dollars in household purchasing power across the Midwest alone. Exports reveal an even harsher picture. Japan previously absorbed close to 70 billion United States dollars per year in vehicles, components, and precision manufacturing equipment sourced from the United States. Under the Canada-centered realignment, that figure is projected to fall below 40 billion within 4 years. A collapse of that magnitude forces factories to operate far below break-even capacity. Once utilization drops under 50%, closures become inevitable rather than hypothetical. Financing costs tell the same story. Since tariff risk returned to the center of United States trade policy, lenders have added significant political risk premiums to American auto projects. Open source bond data shows that financing large manufacturing facilities in the United States now costs nearly double compared to equivalent projects in Canada over long horizons. That difference alone adds billions in lifetime costs, rendering many United States sites economically unviable before ground is even broken. Canada, meanwhile, is absorbing this capital at unprecedented speed. Manufacturing investment inflows tied to Japanese partnerships are projected to raise Canada's industrial output share by more than 2 full percentage points within a decade, a shift normally associated with wartime mobilization or historic resource discoveries. These numbers are not abstract. They translate into shuttered plants, shrinking tax bases, deferred infrastructure, and rising consumer prices across the United States. And yet, this damage represents only the visible portion of the fallout. Because buried beneath these figures is a deeper mechanism already in motion, one involving supply chains, skills, and control over future technology standards that once triggered cannot be reversed. That hidden dynamic is where the real danger begins, and it is what comes next. At first glance, the damage from Japan's realignment toward Canada appears measurable and familiar. Fewer investments, fewer exports, rising costs, and job losses inside the United States auto sector. But supply chains do not fail in headlines. They fail quietly, contract by contract, supplier by supplier, until the system that once looked resilient becomes impossible to restart. That is exactly what is now unfolding under the pressure of the trade war. For decades, the United States relied on dense industrial clusters built for speed and efficiency. Thousands of Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers operated on narrow margins, synchronized to just-in-time delivery. That model depends entirely on predictability. Once tariff risk became permanent rather than temporary, predictability vanished. Suppliers began redesigning their geography, not for growth, but for survival. Canada offered long horizon contracts and regulatory continuity. The United States offered uncertainty. By early assessments from logistics insurers and manufacturing auditors, more than 1/3 of smaller United States auto suppliers are now operating below sustainable utilization levels. These firms do not make headlines. They produce battery housings, power connectors, thermal systems, precision castings, and sensor enclosures. When they disappear, entire production lines stall. Tooling cannot be replaced quickly. Certifications take years. Delays cascade. Here is the shock that has not been publicly disclosed. Internal supply chain stress tests shared among global lenders indicate that once approximately 40% of advanced component suppliers relocate or shut down, the remaining ecosystem collapses nonlinearly. Costs spike, lead times explode. At that threshold, even profitable assembly plants become unviable. Those models show that the United States auto sector is now approaching that point faster than expected, not within decades, but within the current investment cycle. This is why Japanese and Canadian engineers are no longer designing platforms around United States assembly. Research and development for battery management systems, power electronics, and autonomous modules is being optimized specifically for Canadian facilities. The United States is increasingly treated as a legacy market for aging combustion models, not a destination for next-generation technology. Once research detaches from domestic production, industrial leadership erodes step by step. The human cost compounds the damage. Skilled engineers, toolmakers, and robotic specialists are already relocating north following stable projects and clear timelines. When talent moves, ecosystems follow. Rebuilding that concentration of expertise can take generations. What makes this phase especially dangerous is its invisibility. Plants do not close overnight. They quietly cancel upgrades, freeze hiring, and defer maintenance. Output slips gradually. By the time closures become visible, the supply chain is already gone. And yet, this structural breakdown is still only part of the story. Because beyond suppliers and skills lies a far more consequential lost control over standards, technology pathways, and industrial sovereignty itself. That is the next shock, and it explains why this shift may be irreversible. The most damaging consequence of Japan's shift toward Canada is not measured in factories closed or jobs lost. It is measured in control. Control over standards, over technology pathways, and over who defines the future rules of the global auto industry. That control is now slipping away from the United States faster than policymakers appear willing to acknowledge. In global manufacturing, whoever sets the standards dictates the market. Battery chemistry specifications, charging protocols, software architectures, safety certifications, and autonomous driving frameworks determine which suppliers survive and which are excluded. These standards shape capital flows for decades. With Japanese manufacturers embedding their next-generation platforms inside Canadian facilities, Canada is no longer a production site. It is becoming the reference point. Industry forecasts circulating among sovereign funds and logistics insurers project that by the mid-2030s, Canada will command between 38 and 42% of all North American electric vehicle and advanced mobility output. The United States, once assumed to dominate this space permanently, is projected to fall below 30%. That inversion would have been considered unthinkable a decade ago. Today, it is being modeled as a baseline scenario. The financial implications are staggering. Auto and advanced mobility output tied to Canada is now projected to exceed 300 billion United States dollars annually within 10 to 12 years. Export revenues linked directly to Japanese partnerships alone are expected to surpass 160 billion per year. In contrast, United States auto sector output is projected to stagnate in nominal terms, meaning real decline after inflation. This is how industrial leadership erodes without a single dramatic collapse. Policy response options are narrowing. Even if the United States were to unwind tariffs immediately, the trust deficit remains. Capital markets do not price promises, they price track records. Japan's long-term contracts in Canada extend 10, 15, and in some cases 20 years. Tooling, workforce training, and intellectual property are being embedded into Canadian infrastructure. Once embedded, reversal becomes prohibitively expensive. The legacy of the trade war looms over every decision. What was framed as leverage has become a warning signal embedded into risk models. In private assessments, the United States is now categorized as a politically volatile manufacturing jurisdiction, requiring premium compensation to offset policy unpredictability. Canada has been reclassified upward, viewed as a treaty-reliable anchor state in an increasingly fragmented global economy. The geopolitical consequences extend far beyond automobiles. Control over electric vehicle supply chains intersects with energy transition timelines, defense logistics, and economic resilience. As Canada consolidates its role, it gains leverage not only in trade negotiations, but in broader strategic coordination with allies. Japanese policymakers increasingly route North American industrial strategy through Ottawa rather than Washington. That shift would have been dismissed as impossible in the recent past. It is now routine. Perhaps the most corrosive effect is psychological. Global investors, suppliers, and engineers are recalibrating their assumptions. The United States is no longer treated as the default industrial leader of the Western Alliance. It is treated as optional. Canada has become the safe bet. And this brings the story to its most dangerous inflection point. Because once a country loses the ability to shape standards and timelines, it does not merely lose factories. It loses sovereignty over its economic future. That final consequence is the one Washington has yet to confront, and it is where this analysis now turns. What makes this moment so dangerous for the United States is not simply the scale of losses already visible, but the speed at which future options are disappearing. Industrial power does not vanish in a single collapse. It erodes as decisions made elsewhere become irreversible. Japan's alignment with Canada has accelerated that erosion, turning what once looked like a temporary trade war tactic into a long-term strategic liability. The United States built its auto dominance on two pillars: scale and stability. Scale remains, but stability has been called into question. Once allies begin designing supply chains, technology platforms, and standards without the United States at the center, incentives and subsidies lose much of their force. Capital does not chase patriotism. It chases predictability. And predictability is now being priced more highly north of the border. For American households, the consequences will not appear overnight, but they will be felt steadily. Fewer high-wage manufacturing jobs mean weaker local economies. Weaker local economies mean lower tax revenues. Lower revenues translate into deferred infrastructure, stressed public services, and higher costs passed directly to consumers. Vehicles become more expensive. Financing becomes tighter. Innovation slows. The trade war, once framed as protection, quietly becomes a cost borne by ordinary Americans. Canada, meanwhile, is compounding its advantage. By locking in long-horizon partnerships, workforce training, and resource integration, it is not merely attracting factories. It is anchoring ecosystems. Once those ecosystems mature, reversing the flow becomes not just difficult, but economically irrational. This is how leadership changes hands without a formal announcement. Washington still speaks as if time remains. Markets are behaving as if it does not. Bond pricing, supplier behavior, and talent migration all point in the same direction. The United States is approaching a point where regaining industrial leadership would require far more than policy adjustments. It would require rebuilding trust that has already been spent. And here is the unresolved question that now hangs over this entire story, one that has not yet been openly debated. If the trade war continues to push allies towards safer alternatives, how many more strategic industries will quietly follow the same path before the United States recognizes what it has truly put at risk? What makes the current moment especially destructive is that the damage is no longer confined to boardrooms, factories, or trade statistics. The trade war has crossed a threshold where its costs are being absorbed directly by ordinary Americans, reshaping daily life in ways that are slow, cumulative, and politically dangerous. This is the phase where industrial policy failures stop being abstract and start showing up in paychecks, prices, and community stability. This is also the part of the story that has received the least honest attention. The United States auto sector has long served as one of the most reliable engines of middle-class prosperity. Auto manufacturing jobs are not interchangeable with service sector employment. They are higher wage, benefit-heavy positions that anchor entire regional economies. When these jobs weaken, the damage does not stop at the factory gate. As Japanese investment migrates toward Canada, employment losses ripple outward in widening circles. Each auto manufacturing job supports multiple downstream roles in logistics, retail, maintenance, healthcare, and local services. When assembly lines slow or suppliers shut down, the first losses are often invisible, overtime disappears, contract work dries up, hiring freezes take hold, only later do layoffs arrive. Labor economists now estimate that for every 100,000 auto sector jobs lost or displaced, total employment across affected regions contracts by more than 250,000 positions once indirect effects are included. These losses concentrate in the Midwest and parts of the South where alternative high-wage employment is limited. The result is not mass unemployment overnight, but a gradual erosion of income stability. Wages are the next casualty. As plants lose bargaining power and suppliers compete for fewer contracts, wage growth stalls. Benefits are trimmed. Pension contributions shrink. Younger workers exit the industry entirely, accelerating a demographic collapse inside skilled trades. This is how an industrial workforce ages out without replacement. The fiscal impact compounds the damage. Auto sector wages support local tax bases that fund schools, infrastructure, emergency services, and public healthcare systems. When incomes fall, municipal budgets tighten. Roads deteriorate. Class sizes grow. Emergency response times lengthen. The connection between trade war policy and local public services may seem indirect, but it is brutally real. Perhaps most destabilizing is the psychological effect. Communities built around manufacturing develop a shared identity tied to productivity and contribution. When that identity erodes, so does social cohesion. Rising opioid abuse, declining home values, and outward migration often follow industrial decline. These are not theoretical risks. They mirror patterns already documented in previous manufacturing downturns. The trade war was sold as a tool to protect American workers. In practice, it has exposed them to volatility they cannot hedge against. Capital can move, labor cannot. And once a skilled workforce disperses, reassembling it becomes exponentially more difficult. Yet, even this employment shock represents only part of the burden Americans are now carrying. The second front of damage unfolds at the consumer level, where the trade war functions as a hidden tax. Tariffs imposed upstream do not disappear. They move through supply chains until they settle on households. Automobiles are among the clearest examples. As supply chains fragment and domestic production becomes less efficient, vehicle prices rise. Consumers face higher sticker prices, fewer model options, and longer wait times. Financing costs climb as lenders factor political risk into loan pricing. Insurance premiums increase as repair costs rise due to more expensive imported components. But the impact does not stop with cars. Auto manufacturing is deeply interconnected with steel, aluminum, electronics, plastics, energy, and transportation. When tariffs disrupt these inputs, costs spread across appliances, construction materials, and consumer goods. The result is broad-based price pressure that erodes purchasing power even for households not directly tied to manufacturing. For middle-income families, this erosion is particularly painful. Wage growth slows while essential costs rise. Households respond by delaying purchases, cutting discretionary spending, and taking on more debt. This weakens consumer demand, which in turn slows economic growth. The trade war, intended to strengthen domestic industry, ends up suppressing the very consumption that sustains it. Retaliation amplifies the damage. As allies redirect sourcing away from the United States, export volumes fall. Lower exports weaken the dollar's trade position, introduce volatility into agricultural markets, and strain sectors far removed from manufacturing. Farmers, shippers, and port operators all absorb secondary losses triggered by decisions made far upstream. What makes this cycle especially dangerous is its feedback loop. Slower growth reduces tax revenue. Reduced revenue limits the government's ability to cushion economic shocks. That increases political pressure to escalate trade actions further, which deepens uncertainty and drives more capital away. The policy becomes self-defeating. Meanwhile, Canada experiences the mirror image. Stable supply chains, predictable costs, and rising employment support consumer confidence. Prices remain more stable. Investment flows reinforce productivity. Over time, this divergence compounds, widening the gap in living standards between two economies once assumed to move in lockstep. This is why economists increasingly describe the trade war not as protectionism, but as a transfer of risk from governments to households. Corporations adjust. Investors diversify. Ordinary citizens absorb the shock through higher prices, weaker job security, and declining public services. And here lies the most uncomfortable truth. The longer this dynamic persists, the harder it becomes to reverse. Once consumers adapt to reduced expectations, political urgency fades. Decline becomes normalized, which brings the analysis to a final, unresolved question that few leaders are willing to confront openly. If the trade war has already reshaped jobs, prices, and living standards for millions of Americans, what additional costs are still hidden in the system, waiting to surface only after it is too late to change course? That unanswered question is where the real danger now resides. Thanks for watching.